Night at the harbor, 12 steps. That was all the distance they made, then the car behind them detonated. Orange fire. Brick dust in his mouth. A flat ringing tone swallowing everything. 40 seconds ago, a waitress, with no reason to know who he was, had put both hands on his arm in the dark.
Don't talk. Follow me.
He went. He didn't know why through this two shapes moved against the running crowd, calm, methodical. They had just realized the target was still alive. The night Rourke Callahan almost died, he was thinking about fish, specifically the cedar-planked salmon at Harlow and Stone, the way they cured it overnight in brown sugar and sea salt before laying it over the smoke. His father used to do something similar, on a cast-iron pan, in a kitchen that smelled like pine resin and motor oil, a kitchen that no longer existed in a house that no longer existed in a version of the world that had ended when Rourke was 19 years old. He hadn't thought about that kitchen in years. He thought about it now. The black sedan rolled to a stop outside the restaurant at 8:47 in the evening. Rourke noted the time without looking at his watch. He always knew the time. Another habit from another life. His driver cut the engine. The harbor air came through the cracked window. Cold, salt-heavy. Carrying underneath it the warm drift of something cooking over wood. 15 minutes early. That was deliberate. The meeting was at 9. A private arrangement through people he trusted. Trusted being a word he used carefully and revised often. Someone inside his organization had been moving money. Not much. Not all at once. Small amounts slipping between accounts the way water finds cracks in concrete, slow. Patient. Designed not to be noticed, Rourke had noticed. He noticed everything. It was the only reason he was still alive at 52. He stepped out of the car. His coat settled around his shoulders the way it always did, slightly heavier on the left where the lining had been reinforced. Old habit. His two men fell into position without being told. One ahead, one to his left. The same formation for 20 years. So familiar it had stopped feeling like protection and started feeling like furniture. He straightened his collar. He thought about the salmon. He moved toward the entrance. That was when she came out the door. Rourke saw her before he registered her as a person. Movement first. Fast. Too fast for someone who hadn't already decided to move. The restaurant door swung outward and she was through it in the same motion. Dark apron still tied at her waist. A strand of hair loose from whatever had been holding it back. Her eyes scanning the front of the building with the focused efficiency of someone who had already done the math and was now executing the answer. Her eyes landed on him. Which was strange, because she had no reason to know who he was. 4 steps. That was all the distance between them. She covered it without slowing. Both hands came out, wrapped around his forearm. Not a touch, a grip. The kind that means I am not asking. His men moved instantly. One stepped forward, hand up, body already angled between her and Rourke. The other reached inside his jacket. The muscle memory of 20 years activating in under a second. She didn't look at either of them. She looked only at Rourke, straight at him. Like the other 2 men were furniture too. Don't talk, she said low. Level, not a whisper, not a shout. The voice of someone who has decided that panic is a luxury they cannot afford right now. Follow me. Right now, his man grabbed her shoulder. Step away from Mr. Callahan, Rourke said. Let her speak. He didn't know why. Even later, sitting in rooms much quieter than that street, he couldn't fully explain it. Something in her eyes. Not recognition of him, specifically. Recognition of something else. The same thing he had seen in the eyes of people who had made it through things they shouldn't have made it through. A particular kind of steadiness that only exists on the other side of genuine terror. She knew something, and she was controlling herself hard enough that the effort was visible in her jaw. There are 2 men, she said. Her voice lower now. Rapid. Precise. Corner table. They came in 40 minutes ago. Water only. No food, no menus. They've been watching the street. She glanced toward his car and back. I heard one of them say the car. And your name, Rourke didn't move. What else? Driver's side door. Her grip tightened slightly. Not from fear, from urgency. And the word clean. Make it clean. The harbor smelled like salt and diesel and something cooking over wood. He went with her. 12 steps into the alley. That was how far they made it. The world behind them detonated. Pressure first. Then heat. Then sound. Arriving in that order, each one slightly too large for the brain to process cleanly. Like 3 waves hitting before the first one has finished. Rourke's shoulder took the alley wall. Hard. The impact traveled up through his collarbone and into his back teeth. His ears collapsed into a single flat tone that swallowed everything else. Brick dust in his mouth, the smell of burning rubber. He turned. His car was gone. Where the sedan had stood there was fire, orange and violent, climbing the side of the building across the street. The windows of Harlow and Stone had blown inward. People were running, screaming in the thin, muffled way that sounds like screaming when your ears have decided they're done for the evening, his driver. The thought arrived before he could stop it. Callahan had hired that man 7 years ago. After interviewing 11 others, after background checks and reference calls and 2 months of quiet observation, after deciding that Felix Drummond was careful and competent and deserved the work, Felix Drummond had been sitting in that car. Rourke stood in the alley and did not move for 3 full seconds, which was 2 seconds longer than he could afford. They're still in there. Her voice cut through the ringing. He turned. She was pressed against the alley wall, watching the fire with eyes that were wide and processing and not shutting down. Both hands flat on the brick behind her, steadying herself. "The 2 men," she said. "They stood up when you stepped out of the car. They were moving toward the door when..." She stopped, exhaled. "I don't know if they got out." He looked toward the mouth of the alley. Through the smoke and the running crowd and the orange light from the fire, 2 shapes were moving. Methodical, not running with the crowd, moving against it, scanning faces with the calm efficiency of men who were paid to finish what they started. They had gotten out, and they had just realized their target had to move, Rourke said. They moved, not running. Not yet. Running attracts attention in ways that walking doesn't. The crowd was already providing enough chaos to disappear into if you kept your head down and your pace controlled. He put himself between her and the men at the alley's mouth. His remaining guard materialized at their left shoulder from somewhere in the smoke. Where the second guard was, Rourke didn't know. He didn't ask. He focused on the problem in front of him, which was 2 professional killers. 1 blocked exit, a woman whose name he didn't know, and a harbor district that was about to fill with police in approximately 4 minutes. "Left," he said quietly. "Stay with me." No hesitation, no question. Just a half-step adjustment, and she was at his shoulder. Matching his pace with the focused practicality of someone who had decided that trust could be figured out later, and survival was the current agenda. They made that step corner, then the next. The shouting behind them receded. Not because it stopped, because they put enough turns between themselves and it that the city swallowed it whole. That was what cities did. They swallowed things efficiently, without comment, without pausing to consider what had been lost. Rourke's phone buzzed twice in his pocket. He didn't answer, not yet. At the 3rd corner, his remaining guard flagged a side entrance to a parking structure, and they went in. Down 1 level. Into the controlled dark. Into the smell of concrete and exhaust and the specific quiet of a space that exists only to hold things people don't want to think about. There was a car waiting. Rourke didn't ask how it had gotten there. He already knew. She said her name in the car. He hadn't asked yet. He was watching the side mirror and running calculations, and not yet at the part of the evening where names seemed important. "Nora," she said anyway. "Nora Quinn." He looked at her. She was looking at her own hands, like she was checking whether they were shaking. They weren't. Not quite. Close, maybe, but not quite. "I work the dinner service," she said. "Tuesday through Saturday. Tonight was a double." She paused. "I was supposed to be done at 8. Rourke said nothing. I almost left early." Another pause. "Dropped a glass at 6:30 and thought about calling it. Told myself I needed the hours." She looked up, out the window at the city moving past. Funny. It wasn't funny, but he understood what she meant by it. The specific vertigo of realizing that the most ordinary decision of your day, "I need the hours. I'll stay the extra shift," was the thing standing between you and an entirely different version of the evening, between here and not here. Between this car and what came after it if things had gone differently. He understood that vertigo well. He'd been living adjacent to it for 30 years. "Where are we going?" she said, not a question. A request for information. Which was different, somewhere safe. How long, I don't know yet. She absorbed this without protest. Without the spiral of follow-up questions that most people would have produced at that point. The why and what about my apartment and I have work tomorrow and you have to understand, I can't just. She didn't produce any of that. She looked back out the window, and Rourke found himself doing something unusual. He found himself curious about her, about the mechanics of a person who could move like that, decide like that, grip a stranger's arm in the dark and tell him not to talk, and then sit in a moving car afterward without coming apart at the seams. He was curious. He didn't have room for curious tonight. He filed it away and watched the mirror and said nothing for the rest of the drive. The safe house was not what she expected. He watched her face when they arrived, the way he watched most things, not obviously. From slightly to the side, he saw the adjustment happen, the recalibration. She'd been bracing for something grim. Something that looked the part, instead, a converted warehouse space, 2 floors, east end of the garment district, clean, spare. The kind of place that had been designed to look like nobody had spent money on it and had cost a significant amount of money to achieve that effect. Warm light from fixtures mounted close to the ceiling. A kitchen that had actual appliances. A round table near the window. A room upstairs with a lock that worked from the inside. He showed her that part, specifically. She noticed that he showed her, didn't say anything about it. Just looked at the lock. Looked at him. Gave a single nod that seemed to mean something like noted, and something else like still not sure what to make of you. His remaining guard, Breck, 28 years old, never used more words than necessary, set coffee on the table and disappeared again. Rourke sat down, pulled out his phone, began making calls. Felix Drummond had been pronounced at Mercy General at 9:47 p.m. The blast had been catastrophic. He hadn't suffered. That was the only useful thing about catastrophic. Rourke put that fact in the place where he kept things that needed to be carried, but couldn't be carried right now. He'd built that place carefully over many years. It was better constructed than most things he'd built. Sturdier, more reliable. He kept making calls. At some point she came downstairs. He didn't look up, Rourke Callahan. She said he looked up. She had her phone out, screen facing him. A news article. 3 sentences, years old, his name, his photograph. The particular kind of press coverage that appears when someone has been investigated for things that couldn't be proven, and the investigation is eventually dropped and the article runs anyway, because the implication is the story. He held her gaze. You didn't know before, he said. No, but you went anyway. Something moved across her face. Not quite a smile. The shadow of one, maybe. The shape that a smile makes when someone decides this isn't the moment for it. I heard what I heard, she said. Knowing your name wouldn't have changed it. Rourke looked at her for a moment. Then he returned to his phone. She sat across the table from him. Not beside him. Not at the far end, putting distance between them. Across from him, where she could see his face while he worked. Who knew about the meeting tonight, she said. He looked up. The 9 o'clock, she said. Who knew you'd be at that restaurant at that time? 4 people. And one of them arranged the other 2 to be waiting. He said nothing. So you have a leak, she said it, the way someone says 2 + 2 is 4. No drama. Just result. And you've probably known something was wrong for a while. The meeting tonight was partly about that. He set his phone down. You're observant, he said. I'm a waitress, she said it without any particular inflection. Just a fact. People talk around waitresses. All night, every night. You start to hear things without trying. You start to put things together without meaning to. She looked at her coffee. Tonight I meant to. This woman, he thought. This specific woman. Who had a double shift on a Tuesday and dropped a glass at 6:30 and almost went home early and instead had walked out of a restaurant and put her hands on the most dangerous man in the city and told him not to talk. Who was now sitting across a table from that man at 11 o'clock at night. In a building she'd never been in. Asking about his internal security concerns with the calm focus of someone completing a work task. You need to understand something, he said. Probably several things, she said. Start with the most important, the men from tonight. We identified one of them during the drive. He works for a specific kind of organization. The kind that doesn't leave witnesses standing around to talk about what they heard. She was quiet. You heard 2 men say a name and a method and a location. They know they didn't finish the job. When they report back, the person who sent them will want to know why. He held her gaze. You pulled a man away from a car bomb in front of the restaurant windows. There were people on the street. People with phones. You're saying someone probably saw me. I'm saying it's likely. And the people I'm dealing with are thorough. Oh, Nora Quinn looked at her coffee for a moment. Then she looked up. Okay, she said. Just that, okay. Not okay, I understand the situation. Not okay, what do we do? Not okay, I'm terrified. Just the word itself. Solid. Like a door closing on a room she'd already made her peace with. I'm not going to fall apart on you, she said. In case that's what you're waiting for. Rourke considered her. It wasn't, he said, and it was the truth. He called 6 more people that night. She stayed at the table for a while, then moved to the kitchen, then came back with 2 glasses of water and set one in front of him without asking. He drank it without looking up. At some point the calls ended, and the silence that followed was the particular heavy silence of a night that has held too much and is now simply sitting with the weight of it. Breck appeared briefly. Said something low about the perimeter. Disappeared again. Rourke looked at his hands, 52 years old. He had known since he was 22 that his life would likely end violently and earlier than it should. He had made his peace with this the way you make peace with most inevitable things. By not thinking about it directly. By thinking about dinner instead. By building routines that felt like permanence even when they weren't. He had been thinking about cedar-planked salmon. Felix Drummond had been sitting in the car. He picked up his phone and made one more call. His contact at St. Augustine's answered on the second ring. There was a fund there, anonymous, administered through a shell that couldn't be traced back to anything, with his name on it. It had been quietly covering medical emergencies for the families of people who got caught in the crossfire of things that had nothing to do with them. Rourke gave instructions. Felix Drummond had a wife, 2 daughters. The older one had a college tuition payment due in January. He added that to the instructions. Then he ended the call and sat back and felt, for a moment, the specific exhaustion of a man who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and has not yet decided whether to put it down. He didn't notice her, in the hallway, until she wasn't there anymore. He caught the movement in his peripheral vision as she turned and walked quietly back toward the kitchen, not announcing herself, not making it a moment. She'd been standing there long enough to hear the call, maybe the whole thing, and she was leaving without making him deal with the fact that she'd heard. He looked at the doorway for a moment. Then he returned to his work. The morning came in through the warehouse's high windows. Gray and unhurried, Rourke hadn't slept. He'd been at the table with his laptop and his phone, and the particular stillness of a man who has gone so far past tired that his body has made arrangements with his brain to simply continue operating without the usual maintenance. A calm that was not peace, a focus that was not comfort. He heard her on the stairs at 7:30. She appeared in the kitchen doorway, with her hair pulled back and the same clothes from the night before, and the look of someone who had slept lightly and woken up with the situation already fully loaded into her memory. No transition period, no gentle fog of morning, fully present. Immediately, she put water on, found the coffee in the second cabinet, made 2 cups without asking, and set one on the table in front of him, and sat down across from him with hers. He looked up. "There's something I want to say," she said. He waited. "I didn't stay in that room all night because I was scared." She held the cup with both hands. "I was thinking about what you said, about being seen, about what it means." She looked at him steadily. "I don't have family in the city. My mother's in Phoenix. I have a few friends, one close one. I have a lease and a job and a savings account that is honest about its limitations." She paused. "I'm telling you this because it changes the equation. If whoever hired those men is trying to find leverage on me, the leverage is limited," Rourke said. "What's your friend's name, Delaney? Does she know where you were last night?" "I told her I was covering a late shift." "Nothing specific," he nodded slowly. "Filing it. You said 4 people knew about the meeting," she said. "Yes, and one of them sold you out." She set her cup down. "How long have you suspected something was wrong before last night?" He looked at her. 3 weeks, he said. "What tipped you?" This was the question. This was the one that sat in the particular uncomfortable place between what I will tell a stranger and what I am currently willing to tell this specific person who is not quite a stranger anymore. "Money," he said finally. "Small amounts moving through accounts they had no business touching. Shipments rerouted without authorization," he paused. "Nothing large enough to trigger automatic alerts. All of it small enough to blame on error, but you don't believe in coincidence. I believe in patterns," he said. "Enough coincidences in sequence stop being coincidences." She nodded. "Coldwell Terminal," she said. He went still, not externally, He was too practiced for that. But something shifted in the way he was holding himself. A tightening around the eyes, a shift in focus so subtle that most people would have missed it. She noticed. "The men at the table," she said. One of them said it, right before I moved. "Coldwell Terminal. After the handoff." I didn't know if it meant anything. Rourke looked at her for a long moment. Coldwell Terminal was a bonded warehouse on the eastern edge of the Port District. Third-party operated. Used by a dozen different freight companies for overflow storage. Unremarkable on its face. Exactly the kind of place that became remarkable if you started asking why certain pallets moved through it, without appearing on any of the manifests. He had been circling Coldwell Terminal for 2 weeks. He had not mentioned it to anyone, which meant whoever was running the information leak had a source very close to him. Close enough to know what he was watching. And they had mentioned the terminal to their hired men in the casual way you mention something that isn't supposed to matter. Background, color, context for the operation. Not a secret because it wouldn't survive the night anyway. Because Rourke Callahan wouldn't survive the night, except he had. And now a woman who dropped a glass at 6:30 and almost went home early was sitting across a table from him, drinking his coffee, handing him a thread. He looked at the table. Then at her, "It means something," he said. She spent most of the morning in the kitchen, not hiding, not avoiding him. She moved through the space the way she probably moved through a restaurant kitchen. Purposeful, efficient, using activity to process rather than sitting still and thinking too hard. He respected that. He'd spent years doing something similar. The discipline of the body buying time for the mind. He watched her from the table. Not obviously. The way he watched most things. She was in her early 30s, the kind of face that would look the same at 50 as it did now, because it was built around bone structure and expression, rather than whatever softness youth provides and time removes. Brown eyes that moved quickly. Hands that were practiced and sure. The economy of motion that comes from years of carrying things and not spilling them and moving through crowded spaces without collision. She had grabbed his arm with both hands in the dark, without hesitation. Without knowing who he was or what would happen next. He thought about the men he had known at 32. At that age, he had been surrounded by people who did exactly what was expected of them, and nothing more. People who waited to be told, who calculated the cost before they moved, who had learned, by watching what happened to those who moved too fast, that waiting was usually safer. She hadn't waited. She had simply looked at the situation and then acted inside it. He returned to his work. At noon, she put a plate on the table beside his laptop. Eggs, toast, something with cheese he didn't catch the name of. She sat down across from him with her own plate. They ate. After a while, she said, "Tell me about the 4 people." He looked up. "The ones who knew about last night," she said. "Tell me about them." Why? She thought about it. Actually thought about it. Not performing consideration, but actually running something through. Because you've been thinking about it since last night, and sometimes thinking out loud changes the shape of a problem. She pushed some egg around her plate. "I'm not going to understand the details. I don't know your world. But sometimes the person who doesn't know the details is useful precisely because of that." Rourke looked at her. "You're not what I was expecting," he said. "You didn't know I was coming?" "No, then you weren't expecting anything." He almost smiled. This was not the time. He told her about the 4 people. Not everything. Not the details that didn't need to leave the room inside his head where he kept them, but the shape of it. 4 people with access to the scheduling information. 4 people he had trusted in varying degrees for varying lengths of time. 4 people, one of whom had taken that trust and made a phone call. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "Which one would surprise you most?" He looked at the table. "Bridger," he said. The name landed heavier than he intended. Bridger Tate, 18 years. The man who had been standing at Rourke's left shoulder when no one else would be, who had walked into hard rooms without being asked and walked back out again without needing recognition for it. Who had said, once, over a bottle of whiskey in a bar that no longer existed, that loyalty wasn't about agreement. It was about not leaving. Who had never left. "He's been with me the longest," Rourke said. "He's the one I'd least expect." Nora was quiet for a moment. "That's usually the answer," she said. And then she stood and took her plate to the kitchen and left him alone with that. The afternoon passed slowly. His team was reconstructing the timeline of the previous night, pulling surveillance feeds from neighboring properties, trying to identify the two men from a growing collection of grainy images. At 3 in the afternoon, he went upstairs. She was at the window, sitting on the sill with her back against the frame, one knee drawn up, looking out at the gray industrial skyline. She turned when he came in but didn't move. "Delaney," he said. "Your friend?" She was immediately alert. "She's fine," he said. "I had someone run a quiet check. She's at work. Normal. No indication she's been approached or followed." The relief that moved across her face was fast and unguarded. The first unguarded thing he'd seen from her. She looked out the window again quickly, like she wanted to recover the composure before he saw too much of what was underneath it. He'd already seen. He didn't mention it. "I want to go to Coldwell Terminal," she said. He looked at her. "Tonight," she said. "I want to go with you." She turned from the window. "You're going anyway, and I know the specific words I heard." "Which you don't, Nora. I know what I'm suggesting," she said. "I'm not confused about what kind of building it is or what might be inside it. I'm saying the information I have in my head is more useful on site than described secondhand over a table. You're a waitress." She looked at him. Not offended. Not exactly. The look of someone who has heard this framing before and finds it interesting rather than insulting. Like someone using a unit of measurement to mean two very different things at once. "I'm a waitress," she agreed. "Who pulled you away from a car bomb 12 hours ago, using nothing but timing and grip strength." She tilted her head slightly. "I'm also the only person in this building who can identify those two men by sight." He looked at her for a long moment. "Tomorrow night," he said. "Not tonight," she nodded. "And you do exactly what I say," she almost smiled. "That's going to be a shorter list than you're imagining," she said. He turned and went back downstairs. Behind him, he thought he heard something. Not quite a sound, more like the shape of one. The beginning of a laugh that had decided this wasn't the time and turned itself into something quieter. He didn't look back. That evening, Rourke made one more call, confirming the fund transfer for the Drummond family, full coverage at Mercy General, and the college payment. January, the older daughter, in-state tuition at Northeastern, added as a separate line. He did this from the kitchen, voice low, the warehouse quiet around him. He didn't see her on the stairs. He found out later. Or he found out when he noticed the next morning that she looked at him differently than she had the day before. Not softer exactly. Something else. The look of someone who has revised an equation and isn't sure yet what the new answer means. He didn't ask about it. She didn't volunteer it. Some things don't need to be said to be understood. Night came in from the harbor. Rourke sat at the table with his laptop and the growing file his team was building on the Coldwell Terminal property. Structural layout, ownership history. The freight companies that listed it as an address. 3 weeks he had been circling this, moving carefully. Because moving carefully had kept him alive for 30 years, and he had believed until last night that careful was enough. It wasn't enough anymore. The people he was dealing with had stopped waiting. They had decided the slow approach was taking too long. They had moved to the direct approach instead. A car, a driver's side door, make it clean. They had failed, because a woman with brown eyes and both hands had decided to move faster. He thought about that, about the specific randomness of it, about how many variables had to align precisely in order for the evening to end the way it had. She stayed for the double shift. She was clearing the right table. The men at the corner spoke too close to her. She heard specific words. She recognized them for what they were. She moved. Any one of those fails, and Rourke Callahan is not sitting at this table. He looked at the kitchen doorway. Dark. She had gone to bed an hour ago. He thought about what she'd said at the table. "I'm not going to fall apart on you." In case that's what you're waiting for. He hadn't been waiting for it. But most people would have produced it eventually. Because most people had never been asked to be steady in a situation like this. And steadiness under that kind of pressure is not a natural state. It is a constructed one. It is a choice made deliberately, repeatedly, in the face of everything that is pulling you in the other direction. She had made it look like nothing, which meant it had cost her something considerable. He returned to his work. Outside, the harbor moved in the dark. The lights on the water, the slow navigation lamps of something large and heavy making its way toward the channel. Somewhere across that water, someone who had tried to kill him was making new plans. And tomorrow night, Rourke Callahan was going to Coldwell Terminal to find out who. He was not going alone. He had not made peace with this. He had made a decision, which, he had learned a very long time ago, were not the same thing. They went to Coldwell Terminal on a Wednesday, 4:30 in the morning. That specific hour when the city isn't asleep and isn't awake and exists in a gray suspended state that belongs to nobody. The hour when the overnight workers are fighting their second wind and the early risers haven't found theirs yet. The hour when a car moving through the Port District attracts no particular attention because cars always move through the Port District at 4:30 in the morning. That was the point. Rourke had mapped the approach twice the day before. Exits, sight lines, the location of the nearest operating security camera, and precisely how much of the surrounding area it actually covered versus how much it appeared to cover. There was always a gap between those two numbers. People who installed security cameras thought about coverage in theory. Rourke thought about it the way water thinks about low ground. Nora sat beside him in the back of the car. She had not asked what to wear. She had appeared at the bottom of the stairs in dark clothing, flat shoes, hair back, no jewelry, nothing that caught light or made sound. He had looked at her for half a second and said nothing, and she had understood that the half second meant something, and also that they were done discussing it. They drove in silence. She was watching the port pass by the window. The cranes standing motionless against the pre-dawn sky like enormous animals that had agreed temporarily to hold still. The warehouses, the stacked containers in their reds and blues and rusted oranges. Colors that had no business being that vivid in the dark but were anyway. She had put her fear somewhere it couldn't interfere. He had decided that much. The corrugated steel door on the building's south face took Breck 22 seconds to open. Not bad. They went in. Flashlights came on. Low beams angled toward the floor. The interior was enormous. Concrete floor, high ceiling lost in darkness. The smell of salt water and machine oil and the particular staleness of air that had been recycled through the same space for too long without anything living inside it to give it purpose. Mostly empty, mostly. Rourke moved immediately toward the interior. No hesitation, no adjustment period. This was something he had learned young. That building stopped being frightening once you stopped treating the unknown as the problem and started treating the known as the only thing that mattered. What is in front of me? What is to my left? Where is the next exit? Everything else was noise. Nora moved differently. She moved the way she probably moved through a crowded restaurant, aware of the full space, tracking multiple things simultaneously. He watched from the corner of his eye as she swept her flashlight across a row of rusted shelving units along the eastern wall. Slowed down, stopped, moved back 2 steps. The shelving unit was 8 feet tall. Steel, heavy enough to be permanent. Except the dust pattern on the floor in front of it wasn't uniform. Most of the dust was settled, undisturbed. The way dust settles when nothing has moved in months, except for 2 parallel tracks. Faint. Following the floor in a slight arc, the unit had been moved, relatively recently, and moved back badly. Here, she said quietly, not proud of it. Not performing, just a flat statement of location. Breck was already there. He examined the wall behind the shelving. Then a section of the baseboard. Then he pressed something at a specific point, and there was a click that sounded loud in the silence, and a seam appeared in the wall that hadn't been visible a second before. A door, maybe the size of a large closet, which was what it looked like from the outside. From the inside, it looked like someone's entire life had been poured into it. Photographs first, Rourke saw them the way you see something that your mind refuses to process at full speed. Like the eyes slowing everything down. Applying caution to the intake, photographs of him, hundreds of them, grid-pinned across every inch of the back wall and half of the left one. Rourke entering buildings. Rourke in ours shot through a long lens from a significant distance. Rourke standing on the street outside his offices, outside his accountant's building, outside Harlow and Stone, where 2 nights ago he had been thinking about cedar-planked salmon, and someone had been thinking about his driver's side door. Casements in the corners. He looked at the earliest one, 9 months ago. 9 months of patience, 9 months of documentation, of building, of watching him the way a man watches something he intends to take apart and wants to understand completely before he begins. This wasn't rage. Rage was fast. Rage was careless. Rage left errors behind it. This was something colder. They weren't in a hurry, Nora said. She was turning slowly in the center of the room, taking it all in, face still. Eyes moving. No, Rourke said, because they knew eventually they'd have their moment. He was already at the folding table in the center of the room. Documents, stacked and dated, ordered with a precision that spoke of someone who had done this before. Yes, she was at the left wall now, looking at documents pinned in rows. He heard her breath shift slightly. Not fear. Recognition. Rourke crossed to her. She was looking at a series of pages. Financial records, not his. The headers belonged to 3 different businesses. A construction firm, a private marine logistics company, a holding company with a name that meant nothing to him, and beside each name, in a different hand, dates, incidents, a fire, an audit that had led to a sudden resignation, a CEO who had left under terms described publicly as personal. What do these businesses have in common, she said. He looked at the documents for a long moment. The answer sat in a place he hadn't wanted to open. He opened it, they refused, he said. She turned. Refused what? There's a financial network. He picked up the document at the top of the stack. Read the account numbers. Recognized 3 of them from his own investigation 3 weeks ago. It moves money through legitimate infrastructure, construction contracts, shipping routes, loan facilities for development projects. All of it looks clean until you pull the thread underneath it. He set the document down. These companies were approached and declined to participate, and then this happened to them. Yes, she was quiet for a moment. That's not crime, she said. That's hostile acquisition. Destroy them and buy what's left for nothing. Yes. And you're on this list. I've been on this list, he said. For a long time, she looked at the photographs on the wall. 9 months of his face. 9 months of his movements. 9 months of someone building the exact shape of what they were going to take apart. Rourke, he looked at her. Her voice had changed. Not afraid. Something more specific. Whoever built this room wasn't just trying to kill you. She held his gaze. They were making sure you couldn't see it coming. That's different. That's personal. He looked at the photographs. He didn't answer, because the answer was yes, and he already knew it. And saying it out loud in this room, surrounded by 9 months of documented surveillance, felt like something he wasn't ready to give the air. Start photographing, he said. Everything. They worked 15 minutes. Maybe 20. Nora was at the far wall with her phone. Methodical. Efficient. Moving from left to right the way you read a page. Breck was on the documents at the table. Rourke was reading a specific set of financial records that had stopped him cold. Because one of the names on the accounts, one of the authorization signatures on a wire transfer, routed through a shell company, registered in Delaware, to a parent company registered in the Cayman Islands, was a name he knew. A name he had given access to the scheduling details for a private meeting at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday night. Bridger Tate. He stood there with the document in his hand and looked at that name for a long time. 18 years. The man who had told him, once, in a bar that no longer existed, that loyalty wasn't about agreement. It was about not leaving. 18 years and he hadn't left. He'd just been leaving in a different direction. Rourke set the document down. His face didn't change. That was the thing about carrying things for 30 years. You got very good at not letting them show. He took out his phone and photographed the document 3 times. From 3 angles to make sure, he put his phone away. He returned to work. Nora heard it first. Not him. Not Breck. Not his men stationed at the door. Her. Because she had the particular sensitivity of someone who spent her professional life listening to a room while appearing to focus on something else. She stopped moving. Do you hear that? Low? Almost no volume. Rourke heard it in the half-second after. A sound from outside, mechanical, the specific rhythm of multiple vehicle doors opening and closing in coordinated sequence. Not random. Not one by one the way civilians exit cars. The precise clustering of a team deploying. He looked at Breck. How many? Breck pressed his earpiece. His expression didn't change, which was its own kind of answer. 4 vehicles, 12 minimum. Moving efficiently, professional, paid well. Already in position, they had been followed. Or the terminal had been watched. Or someone had known they were coming before they had known it themselves. Which meant the information about Coldwell Terminal had traveled further and faster than Rourke had tracked met. Which meant he didn't finish the thought. The hatch, he said. Breck was already moving. Below the folding table. beneath a section of floor that had been engineered to look like solid concrete and wasn't, a hatch. A service access to the drainage tunnels below the terminal district. Breck had located it on entry the way Rourke had trained his people to locate exits before they located anything else. First, you find the way out. Then you find what you came for. The hatch opened. Cold air came up from below. Salt and rust and the thick, damp smell of water that had been standing still for too long. Nora looked at it. Looked at him. Go, he said. She went. The tunnel was everything the terminal was not. Low ceiling. Maybe 6 feet of clearance at the highest point. The floor was uneven concrete over something older. Brick, maybe. The original drainage infrastructure from a century ago, repurposed and forgotten and repurposed again. Flashlights ahead and behind. The sound of their footsteps echoing off the walls in a way that made the space feel full of people it didn't contain. Running in the dark, not running the way people run on streets or through buildings. Running in the crouched, arms-forward way you run when the ceiling might drop and the floor might shift and the light only shows you 2 feet ahead. Nora was fast. Rourke hadn't expected that. She moved through the tunnel with the focused efficiency of pure adrenaline, doing what adrenaline was designed to do. No wasted motion, no looking back. Eyes on the flashlight beam ahead like it was the only fixed point in a world that had gone entirely fluid. And then the pipe. He heard it before he saw it. The sound she made. Sharp and involuntary. The kind of sound that can't be controlled because the body makes it before the mind has given permission. She went down. Hard. A section of collapsed tunnel wall. Iron bracket jutting at mid-shin height. She hit it at full stride and the momentum did the rest. Down onto the concreted floor. One hand taking the impact. The other barely catching up in time. 3 seconds. She was up in 3 seconds. But 3 seconds was the difference. She was falling behind when Rourke turned, not sent someone. Turned himself. Came back the 4 steps between them and grabbed her arm and pulled her upright and kept moving. She was already moving with him before he'd completed the motion. Already running. The two of them finding the same pace in the dark without discussing it. Without slowing. Behind them the shouting was getting closer. He could feel the weight of the bag over his shoulder. Everything they'd spent 20 minutes collecting in that room. The photographs. The financial records. The authorization signatures. 9 months of documented surveillance and the specific name on a specific wire transfer that he had photographed 3 times from 3 angles, everything. And then the tunnel narrowed. And the flashlight ahead showed a junction. Left or right. Left was longer, right was faster, and Nora stumbled, not a fall, a stumble, her leg. The pipe had cut her. He could see it now, the dark stain spreading on the fabric below her knee. She kept running, but he felt it in the way she was compensating. The slight hitch. The weight she wasn't putting through the left side. The shouting was close now. He looked at the bag. He set it down. No hesitation, dropped it in the middle of the tunnel floor and kept moving. His hand on Nora's arm. The two of them running toward the junction. Taking the right fork. Going toward the echo that said open space ahead, all of it left in the dark. Every photograph, every document. The name on the wire transfer. Left behind to buy 40 seconds, and a woman he'd known for 2 days. They came up through a street-level drainage access 4 blocks from the terminal. Gray dawn. Cold. The kind of cold that sits in the throat and stays there. Nora was breathing hard, not falling apart. Breathing hard. Which is different. She put one hand against the wall of the building they'd emerged beside and stood there for a moment, chest moving. Head down. He looked at her leg. I'm fine, she said. I know, he said. I'm looking anyway. She let him. The cut wasn't deep. Long. Following the shin. The kind of wound that bleeds with the persuasive enthusiasm of something serious without actually being serious. His jacket lining came apart at a specific seam when you knew where to pull. He used a section of it. She watched him do this, said nothing. They got to the car. He didn't tell her what he'd found in the room. Not yet. Not in the car. Not in the gray morning. Not with the wound on her shin and the adrenaline still running through both of them, like a current that hadn't found ground yet. Some things needed to be said in the right room, at the right time. When there was space to hold them. The cabin was Carver's, not a resort, not a safe house in the traditional sense, a working cabin on a lake in the western hills, reachable by a forest road that wasn't on any navigation system that worked reliably. Carver was an old name, an older debt, the kind of man who answered the phone at strange hours and asked nothing, and said even less. They drove for 50 minutes. The lake appeared through the trees like something that had been there forever and didn't particularly need to be found. Deep green in the morning light. Still in a way that indoor water is never still, Nora stood on the dock for a long time when they arrived, just stood there. Coffee in both hands. Looking at the water, he let her. He understood that need. The need to stand somewhere that wasn't moving and look at something that wasn't a problem and let the body do the work of coming back to itself without being helped. Some you can't help. You things, just stand nearby. The first 2 days they barely spoke, which was fine. Rourke worked at the kitchen table, phone, encrypted messages. The slow, methodical work of rebuilding an intelligence picture from partial information after you've lost your primary source material in a tunnel 4 blocks from a port facility. He was good at this. He'd been good at it since he was 22 years old and had nothing except a problem that needed solving and no one else to solve it. Nora cooked. Not because she was asked to, because she couldn't sit still. He watched her move through the cabin's small kitchen with the efficiency of someone who had spent years working in professional kitchens, for whom the act of preparing food was so ingrained it had become something between meditation and muscle memory. She made things that smelled like the kitchen he remembered from his father's house. He didn't mention this. They ate at the table across from each other without making it a moment, which maybe made it more of a moment than it would have been otherwise. He didn't think about that. The third morning he was on the dock before the sun, not fishing exactly. He had the rod. He had the line. He held it and looked at the water and let his mind do something it almost never did. Nothing. Just for a few minutes, he heard her footsteps on the dock boards. She came and sat down beside him in the other chair. The one he'd put there without thinking about why. Neither of them spoke for a while. The lake was perfectly quiet. Somewhere in the trees behind them, a bird was working through its morning. The sky was going from black to the particular bruised blue that only exists in the 20 minutes before sunrise. You fish a lot, she said. Used to. With my father, she waited. He died when I was 19, he said. It wasn't peaceful. She looked at him. The way you look at someone when you're deciding whether to ask the next question. What happened? There were 2 families, old money and new money, and the particular kind of hatred that only exists between those 2 things and when they're trying to occupy the same space. He watched the line in the water. Perfectly still. My father tried to stay out of it. Neutral. He believed that was possible. He paused. In that world, neutral is just a slower way of losing. She was quiet for a moment. Your mother, 2 years after. She stopped being interested in things, including continuing. The lake held that between them without comment. So you took over, she said. Someone had to. You were 21. Yes, and angry, very, for a long time. Made decisions I wouldn't make now. He was for a moment. But I also made sure that what happened to my family never happened again to anyone inside my organization. No one loses a father because he tried to stay out of something. Not while I'm the one making the decisions. She looked out at the water. My mother worked doubles, she said. My whole childhood. I watched her run herself down depending on people who kept failing her. A landlord who promised to fix the furnace and didn't. A manager who gave the promotion to someone with worse numbers and better connections. She paused. A man who said he would stay. So you decided not to depend on anyone. She turned to look at him. You asked about me, she said. Not accusation. Observation. I had Breckpull basic background on the first night. I wanted to know who you were, she thought about this. I should probably find that invasive. Probably I don't, she said, which seemed to surprise her slightly more than it surprised him. I like standing on my own feet. It's the only ground I trust. He nodded slowly, because that made more sense to him than almost anything else she could have said. 2 people who had both learned very young that the only reliable thing in a world that takes things away is the self you construct from what remains. The self you build deliberately. The self that nobody gave you. They fished until sunrise. Caught nothing. It was one of the better mornings he could remember. They shared meals after that, properly, at the table. Not the parallel eating of the first 2 days where the food was fuel and the table was a work surface, and the space between them was professional and correct. They talked about books, about cities, about the specific foods they each found unaccountably offensive. She had a categorical problem with raisins that she described with the seriousness of someone presenting evidence in a court proceeding. He couldn't explain his long-standing hostility toward overcooked pasta. She made him laugh. Twice. Genuinely. Both times caught him off guard. Both times he was back to his regular expression before he'd fully registered what had happened. But he'd registered it. And from the brief controlled thing that moved across her face both times, she had to. He did not think about what that meant. He had work to do. But on the 6th evening, standing in the kitchen doorway watching her read at the table in the last of the afternoon light, he noticed that he was standing there. Not moving, just standing there. Watching her turn a page, he went back to his work. He moved faster than necessary. The phone rang on the 7th night. He was at the table. She was upstairs. The call came through a channel that meant something specific. That his contact at the city precinct level had something they needed to say and couldn't say through any other means. He answered, listened. The details came through in the flat, controlled way that bad news sometimes came. Organized. Sequential. As if the structure of the delivery could limit the damage of the content. It couldn't. Bridger Tate had been found in his car. Parked outside his apartment on Colmore Street. The engine was off. The doors were locked from the inside. No sign of forced entry. No sign of struggle. The working theory was that someone had gotten close enough to make it fast and quiet and had known exactly how to do that. Someone Bridger had let in. Someone he had opened the door for. Rourke lowered the phone. The room was very still. 18 years. The man who had once told him that loyalty wasn't about agreement. It was about not leaving. He had found the name on the wire transfer. He had photographed it 3 times from 3 angles. He had not yet told Bridger that he had found it. He had been turning it over, looking for the explanation that wasn't the obvious one, looking for the version of events that preserved what he knew about the man he thought he knew. There wasn't one. There had never been one. And now there never would be. He set his phone on the table. He picked it up. Again, there was a message. From Bridger's number, sent at 2:17 in the morning. 6 hours before the coroner's estimated time of death. Sent to Rourke's private number, the one known to maybe 11 people. I know who it is. Not just Vane, someone else. Someone you wouldn't. It stopped there. Battery. Or signal. Or something else. Rourke read it 4 times. Then he put the phone face down on the table and sat with the dark. Someone you wouldn't. Wouldn't what? Wouldn't suspect. Wouldn't believe. Wouldn't see coming even with a room full of photographs and a name on a wire transfer because you'd spent 18 years deciding what that name meant, and 18 years was a very long time to have decided something wrong. He sat there. He didn't know how long. Long enough for the kitchen to get cold. Long enough for the dark outside to deepen past the point where the lake was visible through the window. He heard her on the stairs. Then she was in the kitchen doorway. Hair loose. Something she'd thrown on over what she'd been sleeping in. She saw his face and she stopped moving. She came into the kitchen. She put the kettle on. She came back and set a mug in front of him and sat down across the table without being invited and without needing to be. He looked at her. Tell me about him, she said quickly. And he did, not because he needed comfort. He didn't. Not because he was looking for absolution or perspective or any of the things that people offer each other across tables at strange hours when something has just come apart. He told her about Bridger because Bridger deserved to be said out loud by someone who had known him. Not the version that would appear in whatever record his death generated. Not the version that would become the story people told. The actual version. The one that lived in the specific memory of the specific hours. He talked for almost an hour. She didn't say much. She didn't need to. There is a difference between being heard and being answered. Most people, when you're in pain, want to answer. They want to fix the shape of it. They want to put something back in the space that has opened up. She just listened, like the space was allowed to be there, like it didn't need to be filled. When he finished, he sat with his hands around the mug and looked at her and felt something that he hadn't felt in a very long time. Something simple, not alone, not fixed, not better, not anything that complicated. Just not alone in the kitchen at whatever hour this was with a fact he couldn't change. We need to find who's behind Vane, he said. Before anyone else gets hurt, she held his gaze. Then let's find them, she said. The lead came from fragments. His analyst had been working from memory. A partial reconstruction of the financial records they'd seen in the terminal room. cross-referenced against shipping manifests that a contact inside the Port Authority had been quietly assembling for a different reason entirely. 30% of what they'd photographed was recoverable this way. 30% was enough. It pointed to a name, Sterling Vane. Roark had known the name the way most people in the city knew it. Old money. Foundation with his name on it. Hospital wing. The annual charity auction at the Meridian Grand Hotel. A private affair. Expensive tables. The particular class of evening where people wore wealth as camouflage and called it philanthropy. Several names from the terminal documents appeared on the guest list, including one that made Roark stop, including Petra Vane, Sterling's daughter, 30 years old, listed as a board member of the Vane Foundation, presumably decorative in the way that the children of powerful men were often positioned as decorative, while the actual machinery ran elsewhere. He stared at her name for a long time. "You know her," Nora said. "No," he said. "I know of her." He told her about Sterling Vane, what he actually was beneath the foundation and the hospital wing, the financial network that had been quietly dismantling businesses that refused to cooperate. The 12 years of documented hostility that had started when Roark had discovered a trafficking operation running through his port and had destroyed it completely, had done so without announcement and without mercy, and had cost Vane millions of dollars and the trust of every major criminal partner he'd spent years building. 12 years. Vane had been patient for 12 years. He wasn't just trying to kill you, Nora said. She was looking at the documents on the table. He was building the case for taking everything apart after. Yes, the leak, Bridger, the terminal. All of it was designed to destabilize before the final move. Yes, she was quiet for a moment. "What's at the auction?" "Access," Roark said. "Vane will be there. Some of his associates, people who don't know they're associated." He looked at the guest list. "And Petra, why does she matter?" He looked at the name. "I don't know yet," he said. "She might not." He paused. "But she's going to be in the same room as her father and his people. And she's been positioned at the edges of his foundation for 3 years. And sometimes the person at the edge of a thing sees the center of it more clearly than anyone who's standing in it." Nora looked at him. "Are we going?" "Yes." She looked at what she was wearing. Then she looked at him. "I'm going to need something that doesn't smell like a lake cabin," she said. He almost smiled. "That can be arranged." The Meridian Grand was everything the Harbor District was not. Crystal chandeliers. String quartet in the east corner, working through something that had been composed to be pleasant and accomplished both without demanding attention. Men in suits that communicated old money without advertising it, which was itself a form of advertisement. They arrived separately, Nora first, 10 minutes ahead. She walked into the room the way she walked through a restaurant, aware of the full space. Not looking for someone specifically, looking at everything equally and filing it. When Roark entered, she was already at the far side of the room with a glass of something she wasn't drinking. Zissed. Positioned near a conversation she wasn't part of. Listening, good. He worked the room from his side, the controlled handshake, the exact calibration of warmth that made men who needed to feel important without actually giving them anything. The practiced art of listening to someone describe themselves for 7 minutes and making them feel that you had learned something. He'd been doing this for 25 years. He found it exhausting and necessary in equal measure. Sterling Vane was near the east corridor, silver-haired, relaxed in the way that very powerful men are relaxed in public, because relaxation in public communicates security, and security communicates power, and that is the entire point. He held a champagne flute like an accessory, spoke to the man beside him in a low, pleasant voice that matched his public image with the seamlessness of something practiced for decades. Roark watched him from across the room, counted the distance between them, noted the exits, and then he saw Nora. She was 15 feet from the east corridor, moving slowly, stopping to examine a piece of artwork on the display wall, her back to Vane. Her ears, he knew, turned entirely in that direction. She moved past, continued to the far end of the room, found him near the bar, and turned to stand beside him without making it a moment. Eyes forward. Glass raised slightly as if she were admiring the room. "It's Vane," she said. "Barely a sound," he said. "Eliminating you isn't the priority anymore. The priority is making sure everything you built goes with you." She didn't look at him. The man he was talking to moved toward the staff corridor after. "Cutting off an exit, I know." Rourke said. He did. He'd watched the movement from across the room while he'd been watching Vane. We need to leave, she said. Yes. Now, almost. She looked at him. Trust me, he said. She considered this. The entire history of their acquaintance passing across her face in roughly half a second. Then she looked forward again. Almost how long, she said. 90 seconds. She exhaled. They moved toward the main entrance. Slowly, Rourke stopped twice, shook hands, exchanged a pleasantry. The picture of a man who had somewhere better to be and was being gracious about leaving. At 15 feet from the exit, Rourke stopped, turned. Pitched his voice exactly loud enough for the nearest cluster of guests to hear. Sterling? He raised his glass slightly. Beautiful event as always. Across the rooms, Sterling Vane looked up. Every head nearby turned. Vane raised his glass in return. His smile didn't reach his eyes, but it was a smile. In public, with witnesses. Roughly 40 of them. Rourke turned and walked out. In the car, Nora exhaled in a way that suggested she had not been exhaling properly for some time. That was deliberate, she said. If we disappeared quietly, his people follow us into the street, and the evening becomes complicated. He loosened his collar. Now there are 40 people who watched us leave normally. Any move against us in the next hour is a move that can be traced back to him. He won't take that risk. You bought us tonight. Tonight, he looked out the window. Tomorrow is a different problem. She looked at him, then out her window. And the city moved past in its lights and its indifference and its absolute refusal to organize itself around anyone's particular crisis. She noticed something Rourke had missed. That was the thing he wouldn't forget about the auction. Petra Vane, Nora said. She heard it. She was standing 3 meters from her father when he said it. He looked at her, and she looked at me, Nora said. Straight at me. When I was moving away from the corridor, she paused. It wasn't a threat. It was like looking at someone who just heard a thing that changed the temperature of a room. Rourke was quiet. She knew, Nora said, or she suspected, and now she knows more. He thought about this. About a woman who had spent 3 years working at the edges of her father's foundation, positioning herself as decorative, which was maybe not the same as being decorative. About someone you wouldn't. Bridger's unfinished message, someone you wouldn't suspect. He had no evidence. He had a half-finished sentence from a dead man and a description of a look that had passed across a room between 2 women in the span of 4 seconds. But Rourke Callahan had built his entire adult life on the practice of seeing patterns before they were fully visible. And something was forming now, something he couldn't see completely yet. Delaney's last message came at 11:04 in the evening. Nora's phone, he saw her read it, saw the way her face changed. The very specific change that happens to a person's face when something they had been not thinking about directly, because thinking about it directly was not helpful, has now become unavoidable. She held the phone out to him. The message read, "There's someone behind me since the station. Could be nothing but I think." It stopped there. He looked up. Nora was looking at him with an expression he hadn't seen from her yet. Not fear, not panic. Something more contained than either. The expression of someone who has been keeping a very specific wall in place and has just felt it move. Delaney, her only close friend in the city. Vane wasn't just moving against Rourke anymore. He was moving against everything that mattered. And somehow, without either of them having said anything about it, without any conversation or acknowledgement or deliberate decision, Nora Quinn had ended up on that list. Rourke's people were already moving by the time he made the first call. But he could see in her face what she already knew and hadn't said, that she wasn't going to wait. That the waiting had a limit she had just found. He looked at her. She looked at him. And for the first time since a car had exploded outside a restaurant and changed everything, neither of them said a word, because they didn't need to. He told her to stay, said it clearly, calmly, with the particular finality of a man who considered the matter settled because he had decided it was settled, and in his experience that was usually enough. "Stay here," he said. 4 guards. Breck on the door. "We'll find Delaney and bring her out through proper channels. You don't move until I call." Nora looked at him, not the look of someone about to argue. The look of someone who has already finished the argument internally and is now simply waiting for the conversation to end. "Understood," she said, which should have been his first forewarning, because she said it too quickly, too cleanly. No pushback, no questions, just that single word. Smooth as a door closing on a room you won't be allowed back into. He left at midnight with his core team. He did not look back. She waited 3 hours, not because she was obedient, because she was strategic, which was a different thing entirely. 3 hours to let the rhythms of the safe house settle into the predictable grooves of a quiet night. Breck at the front door. Rotation pattern she'd been memorizing for 2 days without appearing to memorize anything. The guard at the east entrance who checked his phone every 11 minutes with the regularity of someone who had a group chat that required attention. 7-minute gap between the east entrance check and the next camera sweep. She had noticed this on day 2. She had not mentioned it. She left through the east entrance. 3 things in her jacket. Cash from the envelope in the unlocked drawer in the second office. A phone borrowed from a guard who had left it, charging unattended in the kitchen. And a name, Harlow Marine Solutions. One of the subsidiary names from the financial records at Coldwell Terminal. She had photographed 40 minutes of documents in that room. She had not mentioned to Rourke how much she had retained. Not out of deception. Out of the specific instinct of someone who had spent years working in spaces where other people's conversations became her information, and had learned that what you hold quietly is often worth more than what you say out loud. Harlow Marine Solutions. Registered at the southern end of the Port District. Minor subsidiary. So minor it barely appeared in the structure of Vane's financial network. Which was exactly why, when she mapped the logic of it, it was where she would go. The most obvious hiding place is the one nobody's looking at. She knew this the way she knew when a table needed more water before the guests did. Pattern recognition. The slow accumulation of paying attention. She moved through the city the way Rourke had moved through it. Not the direct routes. Cash. Head angled away from cameras. 3 different transit connections, each one chosen to break any continuous thread of surveillance footage. He had never taught her this. She had just watched. The building was unremarkable. 2-story administrative block attached to a larger warehouse. South Harbor. End of the commercial district, where the city had stopped maintaining things sometime in the previous decade, and the buildings had absorbed this information and aged accordingly. Lights, in 2 upper windows, past midnight. She found a position across the road, shadow of a container stack. Watched for 20 minutes, 2 guards at the entrance rotating in a pattern she timed twice, movement on the upper floor. At least 3 separate shadows crossing the same window over the course of her observation. And one that didn't cross, one that stood at the far right of the upper window and didn't move for 4 minutes. Not looking out. Facing into the room. Someone in a room who wasn't moving because they couldn't choose to move. She pulled the borrowed phone, dialed. He answered before the second ring. Of course he did. South Harbor, she said. Harlow Marine Solutions. A pause. Brief. Loaded. I know. His voice was tight in the specific way it got when he was running calculations fast. We tracked the same address 20 minutes ago. I've been trying to reach. Another pause. Where are you? Across the road. The silence that followed was brief and very loud. Don't move, he said. Do not go inside. I have a team 12 minutes out. She watched the upper window. The shadow still hadn't moved. There's someone at the window who hasn't moved in 7 minutes, she said. Nora, 11 minutes, she said. I'll wait, 11. She counted to 312. And then the side door opened from the inside, and she understood immediately that a guard rotation she hadn't accounted for was about to sweep her position in the next 40 seconds. She moved. The interior was exactly what she expected. Industrial, functional. The bare bones of an operation not designed to be examined by anyone except the people running it, which meant it was also not designed to be navigated by anyone who knew what they were looking at. She knew what she was looking at. Stay low. Catalog the room before you commit to a direction. Always locate the exits before you locate anything else. Never stand in a doorway longer than it takes to read what's on the other side. She had watched Rourke do this in 3 separate buildings. She was a fast learner. The ground floor was storage. Pallets. Equipment she didn't recognize. Nothing useful. She found the stairs in the northeast corner, which was where stairs tended to be in buildings like this because the northeast corner was structurally optimal, and people who built functional spaces made structurally optimal decisions without thinking about them. She went up. 3 doors on the upper floor, 2 open. 1 closed. The closed one had a padlock that was newer than everything else in the building. Shiny. recent, which told her exactly what was on the other side of it, in the way that a new lock on an old building always tells you something. Someone wanted this door to stay closed. There was a paperclip on the floor of the stairwell. She had seen it on the way up, had picked it up with no specific plan, and pocketed it with the instincts of someone who had grown up with a mother who said, "You never throw away something that might be useful later," and had internalized this so completely it had become reflex. She bent the paperclip. The lock was simple. Not because the people who had installed it were careless. Because it was a deterrent lock, not a security lock. The kind you put on a door when you want to stop someone from opening it casually. Not the kind you put on when you expect someone competent to try. They hadn't expected her. Nobody ever expected her. The door opened. Delaney was in the corner, sitting on a folding chair with her arms crossed, in the particular posture of someone who has been frightened for several hours and has converted that fear, through sheer force of personality, into something that looked more like fury. She looked up when the door opened. She saw Nora. Her expression cycled through relief and shock and then settled on something that looked exactly like the face she made when Nora showed up late to things. "You have got to be kidding me," Delaney said. "Are you hurt? No, can you walk?" "Of course I can walk. I've been sitting in a chair." "Not," she stopped, looked at Nora properly, at the clothes, the borrowed phone. The expression on her face that was calm in the deliberate constructed way that meant a significant amount of adrenaline was being imagined underneath it. "What happened to you?" "Long story. How long?" 12 days, approximately. Delaney stared at her. "Walk now," Nora said. "Talk later." And Delaney, who had known Nora for 11 years and understood that this particular tone meant the conversation was genuinely over, stood up. But Nora had stopped. Because the room that had been holding Delaney was not only a holding room. Against the far wall, stacked in 3 large crates, with the unpretentious efficiency of someone who had chosen physical records, specifically because they couldn't be remotely deleted, were documents. Shipping manifests, transaction records, printed internal communications on letterhead she recognized from the financial architecture of the vein network. The kind of paper trail that existed because whoever had created it understood that digital records were vulnerable to the same people who created them. Physical records in an unmarked room in a minor subsidiary that didn't appear in any official filing. Considered safe, because no one was supposed to find this room, Delaney watched her look at the crates. "We're not leaving yet," Delaney said. Flat, not a question. 2 minutes. "You said that once when we were late for a movie and we missed the first 20 minutes. This is more important than a movie. It was the sequel to Delaney." Delaney stopped. Nora was already at the first crate. Phone out. Photographing. Hands steady in the way that hands get steady when the situation has gotten past the point where nerves are useful and the body makes its own arrangements. She moved through the documents methodically. Left to right. Top to bottom, dates, names, account numbers, transfer routing codes, internal communications with headers she hadn't seen before. Names of individuals she didn't recognize attached to decisions she understood were significant even without knowing their full context. 40 frames. 50. More she didn't count. She just moved. Rourke's team came through the door 4 minutes and 20 seconds after she'd entered the building. She knew because she had been counting, old habit. She was standing in the hallway outside the room when they arrived. Delaney beside her. 3 men from inside the operation zip-tied to the stair railing with ties from the supply shelving in the storage room below, which she had noted on the way up and retrieved on the way down. A decision made in roughly half a second. Breck came through first. He stopped when he saw her. Then he looked at the 3 men on the railing. Then he looked at her again with the expression of a man recalibrating something. Rourke came through the door behind him. He took in the hallway. The 3 men. Delaney. Nora standing at the center of it with her phone in her hand and a cut on her shin from 2 nights ago that had been properly dressed and was now nobody's primary concern. He looked at her. "You waited 11 minutes, he said. "I counted to 312. "That's close enough," she said, and held out the phone. "Look at the crates. 3rd door on the left. 3 of them." He looked at the phone. He scrolled, and Rourke Callahan, who had stood in rooms full of dangerous men without his expression moving, who had read Bridger's name on a wire transfer and absorbed it without a word, who had sat with the weight of Felix Drummond's death at a kitchen table at midnight, without his hands shaking. Smiled. Not the version she had seen at the auction. Not the controlled public acknowledgement with the raised glass. Something different. Something that arrived before he'd decided to let it out. Real. Brief. Like a window opening in a room that had been closed for a long time, gone in a second. But it had been there. The zip ties, he said, supply shelving on the ground floor. He looked at the 3 men on the railing. I noticed them on the way up, she said. Retrieved them on the way down. He looked back at her. Of course you did, he said. Delaney said nothing on the drive. Which was unlike her. Nora sat beside her in the back of one of Roark's cars and watched the harbor go past and let her friend have the silence, because some information required time before it could become conversation. At some point, Delaney said quietly, Is he? Complicated? Nora said. That's not an answer. It's the only accurate one I have right now. Delaney looked at her. You're different, she said. Nora looked out the window. Am I? Not worse? Delaney said. Just. She stopped. Like something got added, Nora didn't respond, because she had been thinking something similar for 3 days and hadn't found the language for it yet. The woman who had burst through the restaurant doors 12 days ago, running on instinct, and the specific cold clarity of someone who had decided to act. She was still that woman. Stubbornness intact, self-sufficiency intact. The ground she stood on still hers. Still trusted, but something had been added. She was still working out what to do about it. The 48 hours that followed were the longest Nora had ever been awake for. She hadn't known that was possible before. She'd always assumed the body had limits, that at some point it simply stopped cooperating. Turns out the body is very persuadable when the stakes are high enough. They worked at the coastal safe house. Roark's team. 2 federal investigators, men Roark trusted, which she now understood was a classification distinct from men Roark knew, a much smaller and more carefully curated group, and Petra Vane. Ho had arrived on her own, no security, no advance call. She had appeared at the gate at 6 a.m. on the second day, dressed without ceremony, carrying a shoulder bag and a USB drive, and the expression of someone who had made a decision that couldn't be unmade and was no longer looking for permission to have made it. Roark had looked at her for a long moment through the gate camera. Then he'd opened the gate. Petra Vane was not what Nora expected. She had expected silver edges, the polished particular armor of a woman raised in serious money, the careful performance of someone who had learned early that appearance was its own form of power. Instead, clearly not slept. Her hands were steady, but her eyes were the eyes of someone's who had spent the night looking at things she couldn't unsee. She set the USB drive on the table without preamble. 12 years of internal financial records, she said. Actual accounts, not the ones filed with regulators. Transfer authorizations. Correspondence between my father and 3 individuals whose names appear in your investigation. She looked at Roark. I know what you're wondering, tell me, he said. Why? She held his gaze. Not for you. To be clear about that. Not because of what my father tried to do to you, or what he did to those businesses, or any of it. She paused. 4 years ago, there was a man who worked in my father's accounting department. He found something. He came to me because he thought I didn't know and would want to. She stopped. He was right that I didn't know. He was wrong to think that made him safe. She looked at the table. His name was Thomas Reeve. He had a sister in Portland. He used to bring her photographs of the harbor because she'd never seen the ocean. Silence. My father had him handled, she said. Flat. Simple. The flatness of someone who has said a thing so many times in their own head that the words have been worn smooth. And then my father looked at me across a dinner table 2 weeks later and talked about the Foundation's literacy program for an hour. And I sat there, her jaw tightened. I sat there for 4 years, because I didn't know what to do, because I thought knowing and not moving made me safe. She looked up. I heard him at the auction. I watched what happened. And I understood that safe isn't a place you get to keep indefinitely. Roark looked at her for a long time. Thomas Reeve's sister, he said. Does she know what happened to him? No, she will. He picked up the USB drive. After this, something moved across Petra's face. Not relief exactly. The particular expression of someone who has put something very heavy down and isn't sure yet what to do with their hands. They worked, Roark's team, on the financial records. The federal investigators building legal architecture around what had been photographed and what Petra had delivered. cross-referenced, verified, matched against shipping manifests and dated incidents, and the names people who appeared at charity galas and had their photographs taken with senators. Nora photographed documents until her phone battery died, then used someone else's. At 2 in the morning of the second night, she was sitting across from Roark at the main table when he found it. The file dated 12 years ago. He went still in the way that was different from his usual still. Not controlled. Not the deliberate neutrality she had learned to read. Something more fundamental. The stillness of a man absorbing a weight that had been coming for a long time and had finally arrived. She looked at the file, human trafficking network, regional operation, financial infrastructure designed by a single architect, the money side only, routing, legitimization, the construction of corporate vehicles to absorb and clean the proceeds, not the movement of people, never directly, always the money, always the layer below the visible thing, and then dismantled, completely, within a single week. 12 years ago, by Roark Callahan. She looked up. "You knew," she said carefully. "I found out." He set the file down. "One of the shipping routes ran through my port. The operators assumed—" He stopped. Started again. "They assumed I would look the other way. That what I was made it reasonable to assume that. They assumed wrong. They assumed wrong." She looked at the scale of it. The scope. Not the violence of the dismantling, which was significant, but the reach of what had been destroyed. The names of people extracted from the network's infrastructure and delivered anonymously to law enforcement agencies across 2 states. Vane lost the foundation of everything, she said. He lost more than money. He lost the trust of everyone who had built with him. When I tore it down, I didn't just cost him the operation. I cost him 12 years of relationship building that he had to start over from nothing. He was quiet for a moment. He has never stopped. She sat with that, with the weight of what it meant, the reason she was here. The reason Delaney had been held in a building by the harbor, the reason Bridger Tate had died in a car outside his apartment building, the reason a man named Felix Drummond had been sitting in the wrong vehicle on a Tuesday evening, all of it traced back to Roark Callahan, doing the right thing 12 years ago. She looked at him. He was looking at the file. And there was something in his face in that moment that she hadn't seen before. Not grief exactly, not pride, something that existed between them. The specific weight of a man who made a correct and costly decision a very long time ago and has been paying the price ever since, and is only now seeing what the ledger actually says. His phone rang, he answered, listened, and whatever color the last 2 days had put back into his face, the cabin, the lake, the morning on the dock, the meals at the table, left it. "They're moving," he said. "Vane's people, all of it, simultaneous." It happened in 11 minutes. 3 of Roark's legitimate business operations. Hit concurrently, a warehouse fire near the old port. A vehicle ambush on the East Highway that his people barely got clear of. A building evacuation triggered by a threat that turned out to be real enough to empty the building and scatter his people across the city. Coordinated. Professional, designed to fracture attention. Pull resources outward. Force response at the perimeter while the center moved, and then Vane Global Tower. Glass and steel at the financial district's edge. The kind of building designed to communicate that its owner intended to be permanent. The kind that says, "I will outlast everything around me, including you." Vane had fortified it, his private security inside. Records being destroyed, the legal machinery already in motion. The financial labyrinth he had spent 20 years constructing for exactly this contingency being activated. He was not panicking, he was executing. Which was worse? Roark made 2 calls. His team. The federal investigators who had been waiting for the signal that the evidence was live and irreversible before they moved. Then he looked at Nora. "You should stay here," he said. She looked at him. "You should stop saying that," she said. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he moved toward the door, and she was beside him. They went in through the parking structure. Roark's man had mapped the building's service infrastructure 3 days earlier using Vane's own compliance documents. The shipping manifests that had listed every access point in the building as part of a regulatory filing. Sterling Vane's own paperwork turned against him. 4 floors, 12 men inside, professional private security, and the same mercenary contractors who had chased them through the tunnels under the port district. Well armed. Motivated by the specific incentive of men who had been told their futures depended on the next 2 hours. What followed was not clean, it never was. Roark had told her this once. In the cabin. She hadn't understood it then the way she understood it now. Moving through unfamiliar corridors in a building she had never been in, not knowing what was on the other side of each door. The compressed physical pressure of a space that was actively hostile, noise. Smoke from something on the second floor that had been triggered as a distraction. The horrible specific tension of a hallway that might be empty or might not be. She stayed close to Roark, not because she couldn't move alone. Because staying close was the tactically correct decision, and she had made her peace with the difference between independence and stupidity. He kept her behind him on the stairs. She let him, not because she needed him to, because she understood by now the difference between a man controlling you and a man putting his body bubble between you and what might be coming. Those are different things. They feel different. They come from different places. This came from a place she had only seen clearly on the dock in the dark before sunrise. 3rd floor. 4th floor, and then the top. Sterling Vane was standing behind his desk, jacket pressed. Posture correct. The specific composure of a man who had practiced composure in mirrors. For so long it had become structural, not an expression. A load-bearing element. 2 guards flanked him. Outside the floor-to-soiling windows, the city spread in every direction. Indifferent. Lit. Going about its evening without reference to what was happening on this floor of this building. Vane looked at Roark, the expression of a man who had been in situations like this before and had watched them resolve in his favor through the application of sufficient resources and patience. Then he looked at Nora, a waitress, he said. Not contemptuous. Worse. Genuinely amused. The tone of a man who found the logistics of his own defeat faintly absurd. Like the punchline to a joke that had taken 12 years to set up, she brought herself, Roark said. Vane's attention returned to Roark with the thin certainty of someone who has 1 card left and is sure it's enough. You understand what you're walking into. Every lawyer I retain has been activated since this morning. What you have is photographs and shipping records and the word of a woman who works dinner service. His smile was pleasant, patient, the smile of a man who has buried more substantial opposition before breakfast. My team has handled more than this. Nora set her phone on the desk. Vane stopped. She had placed it face up, screen visible. The message threads open. 40 minutes ago, she said. From the parking structure, before we came upstairs. She looked at him with the same expression she had used the night she told Roark not to talk. Level. No drama. Just the fact and the space around it. The complete file. Federal investigators. 3 independent journalists. The Port Authority Oversight Board. The Institutional Investment Committee of Vane Global's largest shareholder. She paused. And the families of the people trafficked through your network 12 years ago. She let that sit for a moment. Because they deserved to know first, the composure didn't break. Too controlled for that. Too many years of practice. But around the eyes, the rapid internal calculation of a man whose entire strategic position had been built on controlling the flow of information and who had just understood that the flow had been running for 40 minutes without him, while he had been standing here, procting certainty, while the thing he was certain about was already gone. His phone lit up on the desk. 1 notification, then another, then 3 simultaneously. The specific clustering of financial monitoring alerts that only fire when something significant has moved. The institutional shareholder had issued a public statement. Already public, already searchable, already attached to his name in every financial database that mattered. His phone lit up again. 2 board members. Same minute, both resigned. Vane looked down at his phone, and then he sat down, not decided. His legs decided for him. His guards looked at each other. Roark's men looked at the guards. Nobody fired a weapon. Sometimes the fight ends, not with a shot, but with a phone screen lighting up in a quiet room, while a man realizes that the architecture he spent 20 years constructing has been opened from a direction he never considered. A direction he never considered because it was a waitress. Outside through the windows they could hear it now, vehicles in the street below. The organized, unhurried movement of federal teams entering the building. Radio communication rising through the floors. The investigators had been waiting for her confirmation that the evidence was live, was public, was irreversible. She had given it from a parking structure with a borrowed phone. Vane looked up at Nora 1 final time. The amusement was gone. What replaced it was something more complicated, the expression of a man performing a rapid retrospective on his own decisions. Looking for the moment, the exact point where the calculation had failed. A waitress, he said again. Different this time. Not absurdity. Understanding final. Actually, understanding exactly how he had lost. Roark crossed the room. He did not look back at Vane. He put his hand briefly at the small of Nora's back. Not possession, not direction. The specific gesture of one person saying to another, "You did that and I saw it and we can go now." She went. Behind them, the first federal agents came through the stairwell. The night Sterling Vane had spent 12 years. Engineering had finally arrived. It just hadn't gone the way he planned. 3 months. Not long enough for the investigations to conclude. Not long enough for the legal proceedings to resolve, or the slow machinery of consequence to finish its work. Federal cases take years. The unraveling of a financial network built over 2 decades takes longer, but 3 months was enough for some things. Enough for a man to stand in a smaller office with cleaner light and look at the harbor and understand that the weight he'd been carrying wasn't gone. But it was different now. Distributed differently, carried by different muscles. Enough for the stretch of waterfront where the sedan had burned to be repaved and refinished and returned to the ordinary. The city absorbed it the way it absorbed everything, in its own time. Without fanfare, enough for Harlow and Stone to reopen. New windows, new fixtures. Giorgio, the owner, small and meticulous and 3 decades invested in that restaurant's reputation, had been quietly devastated by the damage. Roark had covered the repairs through a channel that couldn't be traced, and that Giorgio almost certainly traced anyway. Some things don't need to be said. Roark's name did not appear on the federal indictment. His operation was under review. Legitimate review. The kind that actually looked at what was there rather than what it was convenient to find. He had cooperated. Completely. For the first time in his adult life, he had opened every door when asked and had not regretted it, which was a strange feeling, not relief exactly. Something quieter, more permanent, Petra Vane had testified. She had walked into the federal building on a Tuesday morning with Thomas Reeves' name written at the top of her prepared statement and had not looked away from it once. She had spent 3 months in protective custody, which she had described to Nora in the single phone call they'd shared as annoying and necessary in equal measure. Her father's lawyers were exceptional. It would take time. But the records she'd delivered were not the kind that could be undelivered. And Thomas Reeves' sister, who had never seen the ocean, had been contacted, had been told the truth, had been offered something that wasn't adequate and never would be, and was the best available thing. Which was sometimes all you had, and sometimes it was enough. Roark stood at his window. His phone rang, unreal number, Montana area code. He knew the area code. Had known it for 11 years without looking it up, because some pieces of information attach themselves to you, whether you want them or not. Because some absences leave a shape behind that you carry without noticing until the phone rings and the shape suddenly has a voice again. He answered. Silence on the line for 2 seconds. Then, I saw the news. Calloway, his younger brother, 44 years old. Teaching high school in a small town 2,000 miles away. A life built in deliberate contrast to everything Roark had built. A life Roark had respected and mourned in equal measure for 11 years. The way you respect and mourn something that is right and also costs you more than it should, I saw the news, Calloway said again. About what you did, the trafficking network. 12 years ago, a pause. I didn't know, Roark said nothing. I should have asked, Calloway said. He stopped, before 11 years. I should have asked what was actually happening instead of deciding I already knew. The harbor outside was gray and moving. You weren't wrong, Roark said. About most of it, I was wrong about the part that mattered. Silence, Aiden. Calloway used his first name, his actual first name. The one nobody used, the one their father had used. In a kitchen that smelled like pine resin. In a house that no longer existed. You did right. I can see that now. And he stopped again. Something in his voice that was not quite steady. I'm glad you're still here to have done it. Roark looked at the harbor. He thought about a kitchen that smelled like pine resin and motor oil, about a man who had tried to stay neutral, about a 19-year-old boy who had learned in the worst possible way that neutral was just a slower way of losing, and about a Tuesday evening. A double shift. A glass dropped at 6:30. A woman who had decided to stay because she needed the hours and had walked out a door and put her hands on a stranger's arm and changed everything that came after. "Come visit," Rourke said. Another silence. "Yeah," Calloway said. "Okay, and that was all. It was enough. More than enough." Nora went back to work on a Tuesday. No announcement, no ceremony. She tied her apron in the kitchen, clipped her hair back, the same way she had clipped it back for 6 years of dinner service at Harlow and Stone. Walked out with 2 plates of cedar planked salmon for table 4, the familiar weight of the tray, the familiar angle of the kitchen door, the familiar sound of the room. It settled around her like something she hadn't known she'd missed until it came back, like something that had been waiting patiently for her to return to it. Without judgment, without the drama of reunion, just here, still here. The way it always was. Delaney was at the bar, corner stool. Coffee she wasn't drinking. The expression of a woman who had prepared remarks and was reconsidering their tone. "You look exactly the same," Delaney said. "I feel exactly the same. You absolutely do not feel exactly the same." Nora set her tray under the bar. "I feel like I'm going to drop this tray if you don't move your bag." Delaney moved her bag. "You took down a billionaire," she said. "I took some photographs and pressed send." Nora, Delaney. They looked at each other, and then Delaney laughed. The real version. The one that appeared when something had struck her as both funny and entirely too much to process rationally. Nora laughed, too. And for a moment, the last 3 months compressed into something that didn't feel like evidence of anything. Except the specific absurdity of the two of them, standing in this bar, at this hour, with this particular sequence of events between them. Then the moment passed, and the dinner service continued. Because it always did. Because some things don't stop for anything. Not explosions. Not betrayals. Not 12 years of patient fury from a man who should have known better. Not the particular vertigo of finding yourself in a life that looks like your life and contains a completely different set of coordinates than the one you started with. The dinner service continued, and Nora Quinn tied her apron and carried her tray and moved through the room with the focused efficiency of someone who had always known exactly how to do this and had simply been reminded recently that she also knew how to do considerably more. He came on a Thursday evening. The service was winding down. 3 tables occupied, the kitchen running quiet. Outside the harbor was going gold in the last of the evening light. The way it did at this hour, warm and unhurried. Like something that had decided long ago to take its time and had never found a reason to change its mind. Nora was wiping down the bar when she heard the door. She knew before she looked up. There are sounds that belong to particular people, not the sound itself. Just the quality of a presence that a room responds to before you consciously register it. She had learned his without meaning to. Somewhere between a tunnel and a dock and a kitchen at 2 in the morning, it had become information she simply had. The way you have certain things, not because you chose to carry them, because they attached themselves to you in the specific gravity of shared experience and became part of the weight you carry now. She looked up. Rourke stood inside the entrance. Dark coat, no bodyguards. No vehicle visible through the window behind him. Just a man in a restaurant, holding a small box, looking at her with an expression she had not seen on him in 3 months of dangerous situations and closer proximity than either of them had chosen and would not have chosen and were not sorry about. Nervous. Rourke Callahan was nervous. The man who had raised a glass to his would-be assassin at a charity auction. Who had walked into a room with 12 armed men without changing his expression. Who had read Bridger's name on a wire transfer and absorbed it without a word. Nervous. She set down her cloth. He crossed the room, stopped at the bar. The same bar where 2 men had ordered water and waited for a car to detonate. Different evening. Different man standing in front of it. Same harbor outside going about its indifferent, beautiful business. "You didn't call," she said. "I wanted to ask you something in person." He placed the small box on the bar between them. Dark wood. No wrapping. The box of a person who knew what was inside it and had not tried to make it something it wasn't. "I've been thinking about what you told me," he said, "on the dock. About standing on your own feet. About the only ground you trust." He held her gaze. Steady. But the steadiness that costs something now. "I'm not asking you to stop." She waited. "I'm asking you to consider," he said, "that standing on your own feet and letting someone stand beside you are not the same thing." He paused. and that I am considerably better at being beside you than I have ever been at anything else. She looked at the box. Open it, he said. She did. Inside, on a small square of dark cloth, was a key, brass, ordinary looking, attached to a card with an address. 2 buildings down the harbor from where they were standing. She knew the building. She had walked past it for years. The empty ground floor with the windows that faced the water and the force lease sign that had been in the same position long enough to have faded at the edges. The space has been empty for 2 years, he said. I had it surveyed last month. Structural work needed. Kitchen infrastructure is sound, he paused. The rest is negotiable. She looked at the key. This is not what I expected, she said. What did you expect? She thought about it. I don't know. Something more. She stopped. Declarative. I have a declaration, he said. If you want one. She looked up. You walked out of a restaurant 12 days into knowing me and counted to 312 and went into a building alone in the dark and found what we needed. He held her gaze. And you did all of it while being exactly who you were when you walked out of the kitchen at the start of the evening. Not different. Not changed. Not performing something. Not adjusting for the audience. His jaw tightened with something he was working to say correctly. That's rare. That's the rarest thing I've ever seen up close, and I would like... He stopped. Started again. I would like to know what that looks like in a restaurant that belongs to both of us. If you're interested in finding out, the harbor moved outside. The light was going from gold to the particular warm gray of early evening. The moment of the day that belongs to neither afternoon nor night. The moment that exists only in transition. In the space between what was and what comes next, Nora looked at the key in her hand. She thought about a mother who worked doubles. About a decision made very young about the only ground you trust. About standing on your own feet being the one thing that had never failed her, and how deeply she had needed it to be true. And how strange it was, how genuinely strange. That the thing she had believed meant being alone turned out to be compatible with something else. Not in spite of who she was, because of it. The key was warm in her palm, which made no logical sense. But there it was. I have conditions, she said. Something released in his face, small, brief but visible. The specific relief of a man who has been holding his breath in a way he didn't fully realize until it stopped. I expected nothing less, he said. She put the key in her pocket and came around the bar. Outside, the lights along the harbor were coming on, one by one, the way they always did at this hour. Slow and certain, each one a small decision, each one choosing to be visible against the dark. The harbor that had tried to kill him once and had produced her instead, and had been going about its ordinary, extraordinary business ever since. Rourke Callahan had survived a bombing. A betrayal. 12 years of patience from a man who had more resources than anyone should be allowed, and who was now learning, at considerable length, about consequences. None of it had changed him as much as a Tuesday evening, a double shift. A glass dropped at 6:30 and a decision to stay anyway. 4 steps and both hands and a voice that said, don't talk, and meant it. He had listened. For the first time in his adult life, he was very glad he had. And outside, the harbor lights kept coming on, one by one by one, each one finding itself in the dark and deciding to stay lit, like something that had never been in any doubt about what it was for.